Attention, attention, action this day. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Dunkirk, week and a bit. With me, Al Murray and James Holland. How are you, James, this morning?
Yeah, no, I'm fine, thank you. I've busily been measuring first thing this morning to see whether I can get the Dodge in anywhere. It's not looking great, but there's a will. Might have to dismantle the back half. But that's all right. Winter storage.
Right. So today is May the 30th. So today we are talking about the events of May the 30th in the Dunkirk evacuation, the battle for Dunkirk, the end of the battle for France, depends on which is your preference. So what's happening? What's happening today, May the 30th, in this crucial, the most important week of history?
Yeah, no, it's a comparatively quiet day in terms of really big events, but it's a day that sees the advantage definitely shift towards the evacuation. No question about it. Yeah. And it's another day where there's not a drop of wind, so it's another kind of the channel is looking like a mill pond. There are no crashing breakers on the beach and people giving up and diving into it to drown themselves or anything like that. It's flat as a board, and actually early in the morning it's low tide, and it is the 250th Field Company that start making a makeshift jetty. So what they realise is actually we've abandoned all these vehicles. We're not going to use them. We certainly don't want Jerry to use them anymore. So let's just drive them into the sea and create a jetty along which so that the guys can actually kind of walk along the roofs. And actually it proves really, really quite successful. Yeah. And the Germans are finding it really, really hard going. That window of opportunity to shut the door absolutely tight shut behind the retreating BEF, so that literally, had the halt order that we've been talking about endlessly not happened, then I think it would have been 35, 40,000 that were evacuated. Yeah. Because that doesn't happen, suddenly there is this opportunity, and the BEF are now behind the perimeter, behind this canal line, which goes from Burgoo, which is just south of Dunkirk, all the way to Furness in Belgium, and this canal is just such a good defensive barrier because the tanks can't
against either tanks or infantry. Because what we've talked about is how this becomes an infantry battle because of the ground. Yeah, is that panzers are necessarily held up by a canal. Especially if it's an army without any bridging equipment, which we've talked about before later in the war, is that the British have Bailey bridges galore. The Germans never develop anything like that. So
no, they've got little canoes and little paddle boats, and that's what they do, and rubber dinghies. They've got lots of those, but while your enemy is still on the other side, you don't really want to be crossing in a rubber dinghy.
Yes, exactly. So even though this is an infantry battle, this canal is a good enough obstacle to keep infantry out too.
Yeah. So it's like the thickest of castle walls.
Yeah. So even the advantage the Germans have had with their sort of Panzer Fist no longer counts.
And in this particular bit of the battlefield.
Exactly. And what you can do with infantry, after all, is limited if there is a water obstacle. I mean, there's
more water obstacles because, of course, it's very, as you know, it's incredibly flat land around Dunkirk. And a lot of it is below the sea level. As you get to Dunkirk and as you get to the beaches, you've got these dunes, and that is the dike effectively. Yeah. So behind it, it's very easy to flood. So you've got all these little canals and watercourses and all the rest of it, and sluice gates and all the rest of it, and you can open up. And so all behind the canal line, and actually to a certain extent in some of the fields in front of them as well, there's kind of sort of low level kind of water, and it's not enough to drown in, but it's enough to make sure that vehicles will struggle to get through it. Yes. And so it makes it very hard. And what's really interesting is everyone at the High Command and the German High Command is starting to get really, really tetchy, because obviously no one can slag off the Führer for interfering, but von Brauchitsch, who is the commander-in-chief of the army, and Franz Halder, who is his chief of staff, who's basically the man who's kind of. He's the guy who sort of planned the whole thing. He's the overseer of the entire operation. Halder is. Both of them are just absolutely spitting because they know that they are.
Halder is apoplectic at this point. His diary is is as angry as he possibly could be, especially given, as you know, he has vacillated enormously about how he feels about Hitler, to the point of having a pistol in his briefcase to off him in 1939, then changing his mind, having the original plan in place, realising it's not going to work. So he has basically staked everything on this.
Yes.
Personally, politically, career-wise, the entire thing.
Everything.
And Hitler, who he gave the benefit of the doubt to, has fucked it up, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, Halder is to put it mildly, a tortured soul. And this is because he's old school Prussian military. He's a staff officer, and he believes in proper staff work. He believes in training and experience, and he's got the lot. Von Brauchitsch is a bit wet. And there is this amazing episode where Hitler balls him out in November 1939. And he comes back and he's just shaking. I mean, he's physically shaking at this tirade that he's just had to face from Hitler. And it's not just the effects of Hitler's halitosis, which is making him get the quivers. It's that kind of complete impact that someone has. And actually, I sort of have some sympathy, because I've been in situations where I've been in arguments with someone, and I come back and I find myself shaking. I'm really uptight and upset and overwrought about the whole thing.
But you really care about cricket, James.
Yeah, and I just don't understand why the Premiership is being allowed to run, which is much closer contact than cricket, where you. I mean, why the hell can't I field in my village in the middle of? Anyway, listen, don't
money,
get me
honey.
Anyway,
go on.
but the other really interesting thing about this is that Halder kept a daily diary, which has been published and which one can read, and it has such interesting insights. And I'm just going to read you one little bit here, which he says on the 30th. Von Brauchitsch is in a really bad mood. Halder's apoplectic, and he says, "We lost time, and so the pocket would have been closed at the coast if only our armour had not been held back. As it is, the bad weather has grounded our air force, and now we must stand by and watch how countless thousands of the enemy are getting away to England right under our noses." And they're all starting to finger point, and obviously the elephant in the room is that this one has been completely cocked up by the
boss,
by the boss, but no one can say that, so they all start kind of, von Kleist gets a bit kind of tetchy with Guderian, and von Halder's kind of sort of sending out,
because after the war, when they're all interviewed by Little Hart, they all blame each other, don't they? That there's the.
They do, yeah. Little Hart does this famous book called The Other Side of the Hill, and what's really interesting about all those German generals is they know that Little Hart has a certain. So Basil Little Hart was a captain, but he's also a journalist. He's a writer. He's a thinker about military matters. And
a controversialist too. So
but he gains this reputation which is entirely undeserved. And anyway, but he does have a certain amount of influence. And after the war, he sort of goes around saying, "Well, obviously, I'm the father of armoured warfare." And Guderian and everyone sort of goes, "Oh yes, Basil. Had it not been for you, we'd have never been able to go through the Ardennes. I mean, your ideas were just brilliant." And obviously, what they're all hoping is that he's going to put a good word in, and get them off the hangman's noose. And anyway, he's got such an ego, Little Hart, that he kind of falls for a hook, line, and sinker. But one of his great legacies is that he did set up this fantastic archive at King's College in London, which is still there. It's a Little Hart Centre for Military History and Research. And I use it a lot, and it is fantastic. But they are. But what's interesting about Halder's, you can see that this is not something that's kind of sort of. It's not like the generals at war. About the Desert War after the war, where they all start kind of
no.
But
that's exactly
contemporary. This is
that's exactly my point, because the reason the waters got muddied, didn't they, as to who was responsible for the halt order, as a result of things like Little Hart, and it's actually taken some quite recent scholarship to sort of tease out actually the sequence of events and what happened and where the buck stops, which I think is quite interesting, that you're dealing with a dictatorship and everyone's wondering where the buck stops. So it's quite true though. So there is this. I mean, when we started on the with Admiral Ramsey on the 27th, it was 48 hours this lodgement's going to hold out for. You'll get 35,000 men out. We're now several days later. It's quite clear that the BEF have done enough, as well as the halt order, that since the halt order resumed, has been rescinded. They've done enough to hold the Germans up, created enough delay, and bought enough time for the evacuation to get established.
Yeah,
and for the defensive perimeter to be put into place, and as you said at the start of this, that's advantageous to the defenders. I mean, it's quite interesting, is that the BF, when they know what they have to defend, and we talked about this with Pierre the other day. You know, the backs to the wall thing with the Allied soldiers at the armies at this point kicks in, doesn't it? And when there's a clear line and a clear thing that you don't want to happen, they actually turn into something quite effective, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. There's also sort of various political machinations going on back at home.
Yep.
Halifax obviously is, he's toast by this point. But Joe Kennedy is mischief making, and he is the British ambassador. He's the American ambassador to London. He is the father of JFK and Robert Kennedy, and he's an absolute shyster. He's a Boston Irish Catholic. He's a ex-bootlegger. He's dodgy as hell. He's made absolute millions upon millions, and he's as bent as they come, and he's a deeply unpleasant character. And he's also a defeatist, and he's pro-Nazi and massively anti-commie. And he's saying everything. And one of the reasons he's given this post is as a kind of originally it's sort of get him out of the way, but still make him feel important, because he's backed Roosevelt and he's been a kind of avowed Democrat and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
But once the war starts, the appointment is just quickly reveals itself for what it is, which is an absolute disaster, because he's just sending out the wrong message. And he actually says to the British government, "I really think you should send all your gold reserves to Canada," and that goes down really badly. And on this day, Thursday, the 30th of May, 1940, he visits the King to hand over a message of support from President Roosevelt, which he hands over rather reluctantly. And the King greets him in full military kit and says, actually, we've now lifted over 80,000 men. And Kennedy sort of looks at his shoes.
Actually, we've now lifted over 80,000 men because of his stammer.
Yes, and then when he recovers his stammer, he then says, "Just think, all this death and destruction due to the whim of one man." Brilliant. Brilliant. Yeah.
I mean,
such a monarchist.
He's probably thinking, back in the day when kings were kings, I'd have been able to do all that, but I'm not allowed anymore.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly.
I mean, am I right in thinking? So, what are the Labour politicians doing? So, Attlee and Greenwood have also been. They've lent their weight to Churchill in the cabinet crisis. Am I right in thinking they had to go to the Labour Party conference to sort of get permission to join the government in the first place? Is that not right?
No, they don't go to the conference. They go to a sort of a committee to say, and one of the reasons why Chamberlain is forced to resign is because the demands are for a government coalition of national unity.
Yeah.
And Labour will not serve.
Will not sit down with
Chamberlain.
And yet, they will sit in cabinet with him once he's gone as prime minister, which I think is quite interesting, because there's sort of interesting red, to use the red lines or whatever, or lines they won't cross. And one of them is they won't sit in a Chamberlain cabinet, but they will sit in cabinet with Chamberlain, which I think is a really interesting, because after all, it's quite clear that what happens in the cabinet crisis is that it's a Conservative Party issue, isn't it? That's the problem for Churchill. It's Halifax, and he needs Chamberlain's backing to strong-arm Halifax, doesn't he? Or he involves Chamberlain in the decision of co-opting.
Labour say they would serve under. They would so when it's clear that Chamberlain is going to have to fall on his sword.
Yeah,
it's like everyone's looking around going, well, who could be prime minister? And the first name out of the hat is Halifax.
Yeah,
and the second name out of the hat is Churchill. And there's no one else really who's got the stature
and experience.
To do it. The problem with Halifax is that he's a peer, but that can be solved.
Yeah.
the problem is Halifax himself is that he just doesn't want to do it. He knows he's not capable of doing it, and he spends the whole of the 9th of May and the morning of the 10th of May feeling physically sick at the prospect.
And that of course is before the battle for France begins and things go really, really pear-shaped. So he doesn't even want to do it when you're looking.
On the 9th. And it's clear on in the middle, and then on the morning of the 10th, it's clear that the attack has started.
Yes, but it's not clear. They haven't got across the Sedan. He doesn't feel he's up to it before the strategic earthquake has even occurred that we've talked about. So that's quite interesting, isn't it? That he doesn't even want the responsibility of the 4-year blockade war thing that the Allies are expecting to do.
He's physically feeling sick.
It's just really, really. It's interesting because then when things have gone really pear-shaped, he starts throwing his weight around politically about what Britain can and can't do, what he thinks Britain can and can't do. So it's quite interesting because we keep talking. We've talked a lot this week about how the fall of France, once the die is cast by May 15th, really, is everyone's having to readjust the way they look at the world. And you just wonder if Halifax had the stomach for it May 9th, and on May the 10th the problem had been solved and he was Prime Minister, what he would have done if he'd been running the cabinet this week.
It would have been. Yes.
Seeing that
that's what makes you shudder. That's the thing.
It really did. But seeing as he balked at the responsibility of the war as it was intended to be fought.
Yes.
Do you see what I mean? And
I think that's exactly what you're saying.
That's a really interesting
it's a really terrifying. It's a really terrifying prospect. I mean,
because there's. I think you can't argue that what he would have done was gone. Oh well, it's not worth the candle, which is basically what he was saying, wasn't he? His argument was, it's just not worth it. If we stay out, if we get out now, stay out. We can preserve the empire, keep things as we are. Isn't there the story that he goes home for the weekend or something and looks at the rolling hills and all that and thinks this England will be lost, blah blah blah, and you think, you.
I think Andrew Roberts' first book was a biography of Halifax called The Holy Fox, which is what Churchill called him, and he was quite pious and he was old school patrician and very upright, very stiff. He had this withered one hand, didn't he, which had prevented him from taking proper. So he was militarised in the First World War, but he was behind the lines doing staff work. Yeah, he was a desk waller, and he doesn't have that appetite for or experience of war. Whereas for Churchill, it's just it's what gives him his absolute kind of beating heart. Nothing gives him a bigger kick than being in this kind of sort of life or death situation, and Greenwood and the Labour Party say they will serve in a cabinet under Halifax or Churchill. So it's a choice of the two, and then when Halifax rules himself out, it's kind of de facto Churchill, and thank goodness for that. But in May, that Attlee and Greenwood they're too new, they're too inexperienced at this level. They don't have the political clout. They very quickly generate that clout, and they become really key parts of the war cabinet.
The Labour Party completely seizes the opportunity to make itself essential and to offer what it can in terms of trade union cooperation, all that sort of stuff. They jump on the opportunity to make themselves look viable and responsible as government, because the last time they had to go, it all went horribly wrong under Ramsay MacDonald. So exactly. All of these. I mean, it's interesting because all week we've seen these arguments about contemporary arguments about Dominic Cummings and people saying, "Why are you politicising this?" Because it's politics. Everything's politics, even in a situation like this, even in a situation like the week of the Dunkirk evacuation.
Yes.
Politicians think like politicians, regardless of the circumstances, and they're always thinking, how do I finesse this? How do I find my way through? How do we show that we're viable and that we offer what people actually need? And that's the nature of that beast. And I think I think what's really interesting about this week is the week where and we talk about the tactical sphere, the operational sphere, and the strategic sphere, and we talk about but this is the week where it pops up into the political, where it changes, and the considerations aren't, do I have enough ships? Aren't necessarily those decisions, because you've got to sell whatever you're going to do to the population, and this is a democracy. In a way it wasn't in 1914, even that recently, even the last time the UK went through a thing like this. And I think that's what's really interesting. And I think it's maybe the only week where the politics is the tail that wags the dog for a bit.
Yeah, definitely that starts.
In the whole war.
I always thought, obviously, we've read the John Lukacs book, The 5 Days in May. And
can't recommend highly enough.
No, and then I got when I was doing my own Battle Britain book, I then got those cabinet minutes, and you can read verbatim what each person is saying. You can see how they're thinking, and although it's told in the third person, it doesn't take anything to put it into the first person.
Yeah, they're amazing, those cabinet notes, aren't they? I mean,
it really, really is, because
the Home Secretary
when you're reading it, your heart is just beating a bit quicker, because you're just thinking, blimey, this really is tense stuff. On the outcome of this conversation in this room in Number 10, or the Admiralty, where they were the cabinet meetings were being held at this particular time, not incidentally in the cabinet war rooms underneath the ground, is. The future of Britain is lying. I mean, it's just absolutely. It just doesn't get bigger stakes than this. It really doesn't. But by the 30th of May, that crisis has gone, and now it is purely a military operation again for the time being.
Yeah. That's what's so fascinating about this week. And you've got, on opposite sides of the channel, you've got Hitler making his daft decision, because that's the way politics worked in Germany. It interferes in the strategic and therefore the operational, therefore the tactical. And then on the other side of the channel, Churchill making his political decisions the way he does, that then flows down the same way. And in fact, Churchill's able to make those decisions the way he does in that week, because the tactical end of the BEF is holding up.
So what you've got to remember, there's 20,000 men on the perimeter there, holding this perimeter, and they're basically... It's much like your grandfather at Hazebrouck or those at Cassel. They are there to enable the bulk to get away.
Yeah,
and for those of them, they know that their chances of getting away are not great.
I mean, that in itself, isn't it? Is I mean, and this isn't just the brigadiers and the lieutenant colonels and the majors and the captains going, all right, we'll get stuck in. That's everybody. You're soldiering by consensus there, aren't you?
But also you're no longer part of a big advance up to the dial. You're no longer part of a big machine. You are the lifeline for the bulk of the British Army and potentially Britain's fortunes in the entire war.
Yeah,
and I guess that kind of focuses minds a bit. And I think. What is amazing is how well they all stick at it. And when you read memoirs and diaries and letters and stuff and oral testimonies of people who were there, they all knew that this was high stakes stuff.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, other people are kind of still arrived stumbling, having had their treks in from that lozenge that has come in.
Yeah.
They're now all behind there, and they're still arriving at the beaches and arriving over the dunes, and there is this incredible beach with tens of thousands of people, and on that morning of the 30th of May, yes, it's flat as a mill pond on the channel, but there's a low mist which does stop any flying that morning, and what you're seeing is all these figures that look like spectres. They're like ghost-like figures with the silhouetted in the gloom of this low mist over Dunkirk. Whilst you're still getting the smells and the sounds, that oily smell, salt, seaweed, sweat, alcohol, petrol, cordite. What a cocktail! What an amazing atmosphere that must have been then. Frightening, terrifying, awesome, all those things all at once.
A chunk of despair, but also hope. I mean,
Absolutely,
if you want your full on. How many men are evacuated on May the 30th?
So May the 30th, on this day, 58,823.
You see, that's going some, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah,
that's
yeah.
What,
actually more from the beaches. So 29,000.
How many divisions is that? How many divisions is that in effect?
Well, that's getting off of 4.
Yeah, 3 or 4 divisions, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. 15,000 a division,
That's starting to really matter, isn't it?
That's good numbers.
So we're kind of on 100,000, more than 100,000 as a total by now, aren't we? I think.
Yeah.
On the totalizer, on the Dunkirk evacuation.
Yeah, so it was 80,000 by the end of the 29th.
Like a blue thermometer. Yeah.
Yes. We're now at about 130,000.
Wow.
So it's starting to look. As I say, it's starting to shift on.
It's shifting. Great. So that's the events of May the 30th. Thanks for listening so far. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we'll be joined by Seb Cox, head of the Air Historical Branch, which is the RAF's. He's the RAF's historian. What do you people want? Achtung, Achtung. Hello, dear listeners. I hope you've been enjoying the content James and I have been serving up this past year. If you have enjoyed it, and you felt so inclined, could we ask you to consider voting for us in this year's Podcast Awards? There's a special award that's got nothing to do with juries and industry professionals. It's called the Listeners Award. You need to go to British Podcast Awards/vote. Then put in We Have Ways, and up we pop. Prove you're not a robot. You know you can do it. And make sure to confirm your vote in the email they send to you. Many thanks from me and James and everyone at the We Have Ways team. We've talked about the Army and the Navy. So, there's only other one service to talk to, isn't there, James?
Yeah, it's got to be the RAF. I mean, you know the little place it has in my heart as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So
including Spitfires and Hurricanes.
Spitfires and Hurricanes, but the Mark 1, of course.
And obviously, thrilled to see that the Defiant has been rehabilitated this week in a new book that claims actually it was really good.
Yes.
Yeah. So that third voice you heard there, the yes. We're delighted to be joined by Seb Cox, who what's your actual title? Because we've had some very grand people on. What's your title, Seb?
My formal title is Head of the Air Historical Branch (brackets RAF close brackets).
Crikey!
Yeah, he's the top man. There is no other higher power and source of information about RAF matters than Seb. And he is my go-to person on many matters, as he has very patiently put up with my badgering over the decades.
Are you some of the ardour that the RAF has to endure on its way to the Astra, then, James?
He's definitely that.
But you're very patient, Seb, and it's much appreciated. I want you to know that.
Now, Seb, aside from the Defiant's critical and crucial role in the Dunkirk campaign of May to June 1940, one of the things we've talked about, James and I have talked about frequently on the podcast, is basically how he feels, and it's in his Battle of Britain book. Really do recommend the audiobook that I read. Is that that this is for him when the Battle of Britain in effect starts, when Fighter Command gives up defending France and starts defending directly Britain and British interests in effect. This is when the Battle of Britain begins. Do you think that assertion stacks up, or
is it a crock of nonsense?
Or is this a different sort of halfway campaign between the two?
I think, probably a halfway campaign is a reasonable way of describing it. Because apart from anything else, I mean, we're obviously going to talk about Dunkirk, but people tend to believe that Dunkirk is the end of the Battle of France and is the end of British involvement in the Battle of France, and it's not. 17 RAF fighter squadrons, I think it's 17, that's from memory, so I may have the figure slightly wrong, continued to operate over France after the evacuation from Dunkirk had finished. So, and there are still RAF units in France. They don't pull out. The last RAF unit, I think, from memory again, pulls out on the 18th of June. Where Dunkirk finished on the 4th. So this idea that the Battle of France has effectively finished with the evacuation from Dunkirk for the British, even that isn't correct.
And these are fighter squadrons.
But the bombers are operating over France as well. They haven't stopped, and people forget that the bombers operate throughout Dunkirk. There's a lot of RAF. There's a lot of RAF bomber sorties, particularly by the light bombers from two group of Blenheims, trying to operate to disrupt German operations around Dunkirk.
I suppose my argument on this is just that it is during the battle of it's during the air battle of Dunkirk that Fighter Command enters the fray. Fighter Command is designed specifically to defend Great Britain. Up until that point, it's been the air striking force and all the other RAF components that have been sent to France. So suddenly Fighter Command is there and taking part of it. And my point about the Battle of Britain and the wider Battle of Britain is that the Battle of Britain starts when Britain directly becomes imperiled, and it ends when that imperiling ceases to be such a major threat. And so that's why I kind of was arguing that it was when I started researching it really, and I suddenly started thinking, well, hang on a minute. Dowding and Newell are going around saying, we've got to watch it, we've got to be careful, because the whole point of Fighter Commanders is supposed to defend Britain's airspace and defend Britain. But if we're kind of losing planes over France, then that's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. And yet Fighter Command does get drawn into it. So that was why it suddenly occurred to me that maybe one should kind of reconsider it and consider that the Battle of Britain starts in parallel to the Battle of France in that last week of May 1940.
Well, there's some merit to that. Of course, one of the other issues, one of the other issues is that from the 10th of May, well, some. One of the other issues is that, of course, from the 10th of May, Fighter Command squadrons keep getting drawn into the Battle of France, as you well know, and that is what leads eventually to Dowding's letter. But of course, his famous letter of the 16th of May. But of course, the other thing that people either don't know or conveniently forget is he wrote almost precisely the same letter many, many months before, when government policy changed. And of course, government policy, again, this is one of those grand strategic things that people tend to either forget or they don't know. British government grand strategic policy changes when the Germans renege on the Munich Agreement in early 1939. Suddenly, any idea that Hitler can be trusted, that he'll keep to agreements that he himself has signed, is out of the window. And for the first time in UK history, the British government introduces conscription during peacetime. Never happened before. This Chamberlain is still PM. We're going to have conscription in peacetime. You start serious staff talks with the French. The whole grand strategic picture changes. The Brits have gone from trying to keep the French at arm's length to this is now highly likely to turn into a situation where we have to go to war. We better get serious. We need to bolster our alliance with the French, or in effect actually turn it into a proper alliance. And of course, one of the results of that is we're going to have to provide a much more significant air component, especially since they promptly beef up what will become the BEF quite substantially. It goes up from divisional level effectively to corps. And so suddenly the BEF air component is now going to have to be bigger, because it's protecting and cooperating with a bigger army component. Well, the only source for single engine fighter element to be included in the BEF's air component is Fighter Command.
Yep.
So all of the pre-war planning for the expansion schemes, famous, A to whatever letter of the alphabet you want to end up with.
It's F, isn't it, or K or something?
Well, no, I think we get to well, I've forgotten. M, I think, is the final one. They are all predicated on building up a deterrent bomber command and a reasonably powerful fighter command. And suddenly, nobody'd been saying, hang on, we need a tactical air force to go to France. Well, now you have.
No one had even really thought about what a tactical air force would look like, or what close air support would look like, had there? There was no doctrine or anything.
Well, if you have... Well, there's some doctrine, but... and actually, the RAF's doctrine pre-war reads pretty sensibly.
And experience, because that's what the RFC was doing, to an extent. I mean, not with the same sort of... punching power, as it were, that you see with where tactical air power ends up. But the RFC was integrated effectively with the army, wasn't it? And and then the RAF is the sort of knobs-on independent version of that. So there's plenty of experience of doing this stuff. So the doctrine or the experience must reside somewhere.
It does.
It's just we've decided 10-year rule, that sort of stuff. We're not going to get involved in this sort of thing anymore. And like you say, it's March 39, isn't it? Where suddenly, oh, hang on a minute,
the whole picture has changed, and that's when Dowding writes his first letter that says, "Please don't send my Hurricane squadrons to France." Well, of course, the Chief of the Air Staff and the Air Staff say the government's grand strategic decision is we're going to send a bigger army to France. The RAF is not in a position at that point to say, and the Chief of the Air Staff is not in a position to say, oh, well, we don't think that's a very sensible idea, so you can't have any of our fighter squadrons. Fast forward, May the 16th, 1940, he almost writes the same letter. Not quite, but it is effectively the same letter. Because
Churchill will have to read this.
Yeah. Yes, your Laurence Olivier. Can you do your Laurence Olivier impression of Dowding?
Yeah, I've done it once, but I'm going to do it again because I'm so pleased with it. That's precisely why I wrote it. Pretty good.
So does he say to his secretary, that letter I knocked up?
Probably. Can you find me a file that I filed that one on?
If you go back to September 39, bottom drawer.
Yeah, you'll find it in the filing cabinet somewhere under
letters to influence PM.
Yes, stroppy letters addressed to Chief of the Air Staff.
Was he in the habit of firing off stroppy letters? One gets the impression he probably was.
Yeah, he was. He didn't make them quite as stroppy as Bert Harris, but they had a certain.
But your argument, and it's an incredibly convincing one. It's not even a debate really; it's a fact. Is that Cyril Newell, who is the Chief of the Air Staff, his letter that follows has far more weight than anything that Dowding ever sends.
Yeah, well, let's be quite clear. Dowding sends his letter. Right, he sends it as an official letter. So, as famously, Laurence Olivier in the '69 film, the Under Secretary of State for Air. So this is what in RAF parlance was termed an official letter, as opposed to a demi-official letter, which air marshals write to each other, where they say, "Dear Bert," or even "Dear CAS." An official letter is addressed to the Under Secretary of State, so a political figure. And it says, "This is my considered official opinion." Okay, so Dowding's 16th of May letter is an official letter. Newell obviously sees the letter. Now, Newell could have taken the letter to the Chiefs of Staff and said, well, Air Marshal Dowding said this in March as well. But of course, this does not take sufficient account of the grand strategic picture. And it's because Newell says in his covering note to the Chiefs of Staff, which then goes to the Cabinet, Newell says, "I believe that the point has now been reached where sending more fighter squadrons to France will not affect the outcome of the battle. if he had believed that sending more fighter squadrons to France from Fighter Command would have changed the course of the Battle of France, i.e. potentially stopped the German offensive, I have absolutely no doubt that Newell's covering note would have said, this is the opinion of the CNC, AOC&C of Fighter Command, but I don't agree with it.
So where had he got that judgment from?
Well, he's got it from... He's making the judgment on... He, like everybody else, is seeing what is happening in France. The disintegration, of the corrupt French army at Sedan, the speed at which the Germans have started to race across towards the Channel ports. He can see that the French, not only are the Germans moving very fast, but he can see that the French are not moving very fast, that they're not making any sort of effective counterstrokes or counter-offensive, and that their high command is frankly in a bit of a state of disarray, and that they're not in and of themselves in a position to reverse what seems to be happening.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting though that he got the message, isn't it? Because you've still got other people unsure, and at this stage, still Churchill politically thinking, because he's thinking in political terms as well. He's thinking, how can we bail the French out? He's putting pressure on the French to counterattack, to come up with something. Yeah.
The Weygand plan, which was supposed to produce this great counterattack back south,
never quite actually managed to happen.
Never. Worse than that, I think, James. I don't know if you
agree. It didn't even get organised in the first place.
Exactly. It never.
It was a total non-starter.
Yeah. But Newell had clocked, had the penny had dropped for him at least.
Yes.
So he's then able to say, I agree with Dowding, and we need to listen to the guy who's actually going to have to solve this problem when it arises.
Correct. And of course there are other voices. Air Marshal Barrett, C&C of the British Air Forces France, is sending exactly contrary messages back to London. We need to send more fighter squadrons to try and stabilise the situation.
Because they've all been shot up on the ground, so it would be a really good idea to send some more over.
Well, yeah.
To be shot up on the ground.
Yeah. So Barrett, another air marshal, is sending exactly contrary messages into the Chief of the Air Staff. And again, Newell's judgment here is, well, I don't think Barrett is correct. We cannot restore this situation as easily as is being suggested, merely by sending good squadrons after bad, if you like.
So don't reinforce failure.
Correct.
Simple as that.
Yeah.
Gosh, fascinating. Because after all, I suppose Barrett's thinking, I can't admit I'm licked. On some level, isn't he?
At one level, yeah, but Barrett's operational responsibility he is still the AOC&C of British Air Forces in France, and his remit is to try and turn things around in France.
To stabilise the battle, exactly.
So he from his operational perspective, and this is the important point, Dowding's perspective is AOC&C Fighter Command. That's why he writes the letters he does in, March 39, early 39. He writes the first letter saying, if you send my Hurricane squadrons to France, he actually uses the analogy of it'll be a tap through which the Hurricane squadron reinforcements to France will flow once the war starts. And in that sense, he's correct.
That's right, yeah.
Barrett, as an operational commander in France, has that operational commander's perspective. If I'm going to restore this situation, I will need more resources.
Yeah. So they're just doing their jobs.
Yeah.
In effect. But then it's Newell's job to make the judgment call. So it's not a judgment call really from Dowding. It's Dowding doing his job, protecting his assets, protecting his patch. I mean,
it's Dowding fighting his corner.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's a better way of putting it, because protecting his patch makes it sound a bit sort of the insincere in a way, if you see what I mean. Whereas obviously he's fighting.
He's quite sincere, but you can, I think, reasonably say that Dowding's grand strategic vision was probably lacking. And I say that not because he's fighting his corner and saying it's perfectly reasonable to state this is what I consider to be the minimum number of squadrons that are required for me to perform my role. But it is the Chief of the Air Staff and the Air Staff's job to assess all of the competing commands, all of the requirements of all the competing commands when resources are not sufficient to give everybody. Nobody ever has everything that they want.
Yeah.
Never happens, especially at the beginning of a war. It doesn't even really happen at the end of a war, although you get a hell of a lot closer. What Dowding, I think, tends to fail to do is to appreciate the problem of people like Newell. And you know, people criticise Harris for writing sibyllous, stroppy letters about his resources being tranched to go off to fight the Battle of the Atlantic. But he's only doing exactly the same thing that Dowding does. But Dowding is a great hero for doing this, whereas Bert Harris is a great, you know...
he's an anti-hero.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, he's even ruder than Dowding when he writes his letters.
He really is.
He calls Coastal Command an obstacle to victory, which is a little bit rich, I have to say.
But it's also, I mean, Barrett is in charge of all air forces, and there is the air component of the BEF, and then there is the Advanced Air Striking Force. But many of the fighters they are taken from Fighter Command to join the Advanced Air Striking Force. But at that point, they're no longer in Fighter Command; they're part of the Advanced Air Striking Force.
That's true.
But over Dunkirk, you have got Fighter Command as Fighter Command operating over Dunkirk.
You have, and post the 10th of May, further reinforcing squadrons are taken from Fighter Command to go to France. And the plan, before the Germans invaded, was to send 4 initially. In fact, initially they send 3. Why? Well, because the Germans have now invaded Norway as well. So one of the 4, funny old thing, is now earmarked to go off north to fight the Germans in Norway.
And a lot of good they're going to do.
Well, again, but if you send the British Army to Norway, it needs some air cover. So, funny old thing. I mean, we send a Gladiator squadron. Well, good luck with that. You know, but there's a Hurricane 46 squadron goes to Norway.
Yeah.
They do a
it's not just Gladiators, is it?
No. 46 Hurricane squadron goes to Norway under the later Air Chief Marshal Bing Cross, squadron leader at the time.
Yes, of course.
And
46 squadron is an eminent RAF squadron, isn't it?
And it fights.
Is that the Fighting Cox?
I can't remember. No, 43 is the Fighting Cox. Anyway, they go to Norway. They fight reasonably well given the situation that they're faced with, which is pretty horrendous. They then
no spares, hardly any fuel.
They then perform the magnificent job of getting their remaining aircraft off and landing them on HMS Glorious. Never been done before. Hurricanes with no arrestor hooks. These are not Sea Hurricanes. They get them all down on the deck of the carrier. And wonderful, the Royal Navy then proceeds to ensure that HMS Glorious meets Charles Eisenhower and disappears below the waves. Thanks very much. And Bing Cross is one of only 2 pilots to survive the sinking. You know, sadly, most of the guys die when the Glorious goes down. He survives for 2 days in a Carly float.
It's an amazing story, isn't it? It is
amazing. The thing that's striking me about this is how flexible the RAF is at this point. Well, we're going to have to, and a lot of this is to do with grass airfield capable aircraft. That what you don't need is vast stretches of tarmac to move your planes about, do you? But that they're able to go. All right, we'll deploy 4 more squadrons in France or wherever you want them. The flexibility is given what the RAF is, which is. You know, it's not people think of the pilots, but every aircraft comes with a host of crew and then and clerks. And, you know, I mean, my father's army view of the RAF. It's full of blokes. The RAF is just full of blokes, endless bloody blokes, is what he always says about the RAF. But how flexible it is. Yeah, we need a squadron in Norway. We need some in France. I think it's really striking. In this conversation, this thing is really striking me. And that obviously there's a bit of the RAF that goes, yeah, okay, no problem. We'll pack it all up and we'll send it somehow. It's incredible.
Yeah. There are elements of the RAF that are pretty flexible. And it does require quite a substantial tail.
Yeah.
Of course.
And indeed, at the end of the French campaign, that tail is effectively, not the men, but the equipment. Much of the equipment is left in France. £1 million. This is 1940 million pounds, not 2020 million pounds. Yeah. £1 million worth of equipment is left behind in France. At the end of the campaign. That's an awful lot.
And so the Germans then, I suppose, take that and have a look at it, take it apart.
Yeah,
figure out what.
Yeah,
take it to Russia.
Yeah. I'm sure they use some of it. Yeah.
Yeah. But Seb, to go back to Dunkirk and the air battle for Dunkirk. So there is this perception at the time that where's the bloody RAF, all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And but actually, I mean, my reading of it is that the RAF perform exceptionally well over Dunkirk.
I think they do pretty well.
I mean, the balance sheet is, by my reckoning, 219 Luftwaffe aircraft shot down, with a loss of 331 aircrew to 189 stroke 198, 195.
Yeah, there's always arguments about figures. Always.
But it's a ballpark figure. They're not far off.
The RAF Fighter Command loses about approximately 100 aircrafts. The usual figure quoted is 106. The figure for the Germans fluctuates wildly. So in the fighting over Dunkirk, some of the sources claim the Germans lost slightly fewer than the RAF. So in the 90s. And again, one of the problems is it's a bit difficult to disentangle Luftwaffe losses elsewhere in France from Luftwaffe losses over Dunkirk. Right. So I'm always wary about, trying to say who's won and who's lost in that sort of situation, because the figures quite frequently.
But one of the key things one of the key developments here is that obviously that Goering has boasted that Luftwaffe can stop the British from getting back. They don't, and one of the reasons of that is because the Luftwaffe has put huge amount of store in dive bombing, and on one level, dive bombing is quite a good idea because you dive down, which means you're closer to the target, which means you're more likely to be more accurate, which means you need less ordnance to destroy it, which means you need less aircraft to do the job. So, on a kind of sort of on paper, it all looks great, and obviously in the kind of sort of Warsaw and over Rotterdam, and in the attack across Sedan and all the rest of it, what's happening is a lot of these dive bombers have got complete control of the airspace. They're not being hassled too much by Dewatines or Moraines or even Hurricanes, and they can get on with it. What starts to come to the fore over Dunkirk is that it's one thing hitting a whopping great factory that's sort of absolutely static and filling a field or the edge of a town. It's quite another hitting a destroyer, which from 6,000 feet looks like a pencil and is wobbling around all over the place and zigzagging. And it's incredibly difficult because you've got a nanosecond in which to kind of hit it, and chances are you're not going to. The second problem, of course, is that if you're Stuka, as you come out of your dive, on go the air brakes, and you're almost at a standstill for a brief moment as you desperately try to climb up again. And for any waiting Spitfire Hurricane like a hawk, it just sort of pounces down on it, and it's pretty easy meat. And the kind of the kind of failure of the dive bomber sort of reaches its peak during the Battle of Britain when the Stukas are withdrawn after 10 days after Eagle Day, and so for me it's quite an interesting moment in the air war that suddenly the chinks in the dive bombing strategy, of which the Luftwaffe high command are extremely wedded, start to reveal themselves.
Yeah, I think there's an element of truth in that. The Stuka is undoubtedly a very, very vulnerable aeroplane if you do not have air superiority. And I don't think either side has air superiority over Dunkirk. In fact, I think I'm right in saying that at one point on one day, and I don't want to I want to stress this is not for the entire 9 days. At one point, I think it's Luftwaffe 2 says, we've lost air superiority over Dunkirk. Now, that's obviously a snapshot from a diary on one day. And they were certainly quite surprised on the 27th at what happened to them over Dunkirk. They lost about 10% of the sorties, which came as a bit of a shock, I think, compared to having had it all their own way, or significantly more their own way in the battle thus far. That came as an unpleasant surprise. And Kesselring in his memoirs talks about, how the Spitfire really, and of course the Spitfire, as you said, only appears initially in these battles. Kesselring refers to the Spitfire being the key. Well, of course, we all know that any Luftwaffe pilot who's shot down is always shot down by a Spitfire. He's never ever shot down by a Hurricane. Yeah. It can't possibly be a Hurricane that shot him down. There's Spitfire phobia beginning to develop already in the Luftwaffe, where everything that shoots at you is a Spitfire. Well, it's not.
Well, it's a bit like being shot up by a Tiger tank, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly the same.
All Panzer IVs in Normandy are Tigers. We all know that. Yeah. So there is that element. And the Spitfire squadrons do start operating along the French coast, not inside the French coast. Even before Dunkirk, they start operating. Again, people tend to forget that some troops were pulled out from Boulogne and Calais before the Dunkirk evacuation starts.
The useless mouths and all the rest of it.
And the RAF was operating along the coast, flying fighter sorties along the coast around Boulogne and Calais before you get to the 26th, 27th and the start of the Dunkirk op. So the Germans meet the first Spitfires slightly before Dunkirk.
Yeah.
And they do think, ooh, this isn't quite so. Yeah, this isn't quite so easy.
Yeah. It's also a crucial time for fighter command pilots, isn't it? Because a lot of them who haven't had experience of France and who have, I'm sort of thinking of, I've just been rereading Cocky Dundas's memoirs, and it's his first time over there. 92 Squadron kind of fly over Dunkirk. Obviously, they lose Roger Bushell famously or infamously, depending on which way you look at it. But a lot of these guys get their first taste, don't they? So that kind of sort of awful shock of and discombobulation of going into air combat for the first time is over. I mean, obviously for some people permanently, but for others, it's a crucial time to get experience as well.
Yeah, they do. And the Spitfire squadrons really have very little combat experience. They've chased a few German reconnaissance aircraft and the odd aircraft, trying to bomb shipping off the coast. That's all they've done.
Yep.
Otherwise, they've been practicing probably Fighter Command's famous fighter area attacks, which proved so brilliantly successful.
Number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Which they probably never ever practiced again after that.
No, I'm sure.
So yeah, they get blooded, quite literally, over Dunkirk and Boulogne and Calais.
And of course, famously, the Battle of Britain is about the RDF, the Observer Corps, and the Dowding system. For the Dunkirk battles, they're being put up to patrol. They're not being vectored at all, are they? They're or is there an attempt to do any proper vectoring? How's it working? What's the system?
Well, I don't think, and there's very little in the literature that talks about this. And I think the reason is twofold. One, the chain-home radars on the East Coast, they just about, are able to pick up formations inside the French coast.
Right.
It all depends on various things like height and what have you. But if you look at some of the few remaining track tracing charts from the radars, and you look at the ones from the Battle of Britain, they pick up the German raids just inside the Pas-de-Calais. So by the time that appears on a radar, unless your fighter squadron is already over the area where the German raid is, you're not going to be able to get it to move, 20 miles north or whatever in time to make an interception before it's dropped its bombs on Dunkirk or the beaches at Le Pan or wherever.
Yeah.
So that's problem one. And problem two is they're still using TR-9D HF radios. And I remember reading at least one fighter pilot who said, "Oh well, once we'd left Hawkinge or Manston, wherever he'd gone from, and flew off over the Channel," he said, we never heard anything more from the UK. The radios just weren't good enough to allow the communication to be quick enough. And you also have to remember that even during the Battle of Britain, you've only really got 4 channels on these radios, and you have to set the crystals as they were, because they're crystal radio sets. You have to set them before you set off, and that's why a sector station in the UK during the Battle of Britain is not controlling more than 4 fighter squadrons because there's not enough channels.
Yep.
So
it really is. I mean, the amazing thing is, it's such a reminder that all this stuff is absolutely in its infancy at this stage, and and we have to remind ourselves that the Downing system that gets put in place is the world's first fully coordinated air defence system. There is no other anywhere on the planet, and so there is a kind of experimental nature to the whole thing. I mean, obviously they've been practicing and testing it and training on it and training how to use it, but even as the summer of 1940 progresses, obviously, if you're at a radar station, your ability to anticipate and predict what is coming your way is going to be much better by the end of August than it is at the beginning of July, because you've had so much more experience of doing it.
Yeah, absolutely true.
And Dunkirk is really important. But for that reason, for fighter command, it might not be testing the air defence system, but it is giving the opportunity of these Spitfire pilots, particularly. I mean, obviously, a lot of the Hurricane pilots squadrons have already been flying, but the Spitfire pilots to get this crack. And I do remember that amazing story. I remember talking to Alan Wright, who was one of the quiet ones in 92 Squadron. He wasn't one of the Hellraisers, and his best friend was Pat Learmont. And on their first sortie, and maybe it was the second sortie, but it was on the first day anyway, the 92 Squadron were over Dunkirk. He looks out over his starboard wing, and there is his best friend with whom he is sharing a room, and they both have sort of girlfriends, and they go out as foursomes socially, and they're absolutely completely tight with one another. He sees him going down in flames, and that's him. And he then flies back again to Dunkirk later that day. So I think it was the first sortie. And I remember him so clearly, talking to him in his home in Devon, and him saying to me, that night I finally got home, the second sortie over to Dunkirk, I had so much to think about, I couldn't really afford to think too much about Pat. But he said, I got into my room and there was his damp towel still on his unmade bed from this morning, and he was no longer there. He was now sitting at the bottom of the English Channel, and he said, I had a hot bath and I wept like I've never wept before or since. Wow, what an introduction to combat. I mean, that's if you're ever doubting the realities of war, that's bringing it home to roost, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean it was a pretty brutal introduction for many of them. There's no doubt about that. And Park loses 60 fighter pilots over Dunkirk.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Come home.
Yep. I mean that's a big hit, isn't it? 60 doesn't sound like very many, but of highly trained single engine fighter planes just before the big battle that's going to come, that's quite a big hit. And you know, I suppose it's also worth just mentioning, of course, that one of the reasons why the guys on the ground don't see the whole point about fighter planes is they're supposed to be high, you know, so they're above the 10 Thames cloud and the oil smoky pool from the oil depots on fire and all the rest of it. Yeah,
and of course, both the Navy and the Army famously shoot at all aeroplanes because they're all German.
Yeah.
And
they're still doing it in 1943.
Yeah, they are. And that's absolutely true, because there's just two famous incidents with, to his credit, Rear Admiral Wake Walker, who's made the senior naval officer in Dunkirk. So he's over there. And he's actually on the destroyer Keith at one point, which gets sunk a bit later on. But he says some Spitfires fly over and every ship starts firing at them. So he says, you know, he's ordered the ceasefire gong to be sounded on Keith, and he said the anti-aircraft gunner on that destroyer simply ignored it and went on firing, either because he couldn't hear it because he was firing, or because he was ignoring it because he thought it was a German. And he said every ship in the fleet was doing the same. And then a little bit later, he's ashore with Captain Tennant, who, of course, sadly, a bit later goes down with force Z. But Captain Tennant is the naval officer in the dockyard trying to control things in Dunkirk port itself. They're standing on the mole, and a Lysander flies over. And again, everybody starts shooting at the Lysander. And Captain Tennant turns to Wake Walker and says, "Oh, that damn chap, he's flying backwards and forwards all the time. Damn German." Oh. And Wake Walker says, well, that's a Lysander, and I think that's the reconnaissance that I requested of the Dunkirk moles to see whether it was possible to get any more shipping in and what have you. And
that's absolutely brilliant.
He said, fortunately, his last words were to the effect, fortunately, it didn't seem to do the chap any harm. Well, I hope he was right.
Well, that was all right then.
I hope the Lysander got home. But, you know, that was the Admiral who admitted that on two separate occasions.
That's so funny.
He knew that the Navy was gaily firing away at their own side. So when they can see the RAF, and of course, famously, most of the patrol lines are further inland, because you don't want the patrol line right over the top of the port. It's bloody useless there.
Yeah.
So the Royal Absent Force is a bit further into France. And as you say, you know, another guy who got shot down and picked up by the Navy was talking about the fact that the perspective from the ground, he said, was very different, because there was a thin layer of cloud and he could see that some ships further over were being bombed.
Yeah.
He could also see an RAF fighter squadron, and it's a fairly thin layer of cloud. He could see them up above the cloud, and all of the Navy guys would say, "What's the matter with them? You know, the Germans are over there. Why aren't they chasing them?" But he knew perfectly well that up above the cloud, it's very difficult to see bombers in the cloud. If they're in the cloud, you may be only a mile away or half a mile away. You can't see them. You don't know where they are. And he said another time he could see bombs falling on a ship below, and he couldn't, when he was actually flying, he could not find the bomber that was dropping the bombs. He was looking for it and he couldn't find it.
Incredible.
Yeah, and also, I mean, the sky's a big place, isn't it?
It is. It is.
Well, Seb, that's absolutely fantastic. It really is.
Yeah, unbelievable.
So as per usual, this always happens. We always go, right, we're going to talk for 15, 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Maybe half an hour. Here we are, 45 minutes later.
45
No,
minutes.
it's been fantastic.
Sorry about that.
No need to apologise at all. It's been brilliant. I've really enjoyed
Wonderful.
it.
Thank you so much.
Always.
I do have to add one last one, actually, which was...
Yeah, do.
It was probably very fortunate in the light of the point that we've just made about, you know, the Navy always shooting at the RAF. and the army too. It was probably very fortunate in retrospect, though I have to say it appears a dumb decision. But one of the things the army did very early in the evacuation was to order all their heavy anti-aircraft batteries, all the 3.7-inch batteries, to destroy their guns and ship all the blokes back home. So all the army's heavy AA batteries left.
Which could have been
left early on. Now, that was probably fortunate for the RAF, but also probably fortunate for the Luftwaffe.
Yeah.
And on that note, I'll shut up.
Thank you, Seb. That was absolutely brilliant. Thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Fascinating. Right, well, that's it for today. But we'll be back tomorrow for the next instalment of the Dunkirk story. Thanks for listening. Bye.